Dude, that was totally something was on my end was goofing, dude. We don't have anybody here right now. There was like 25 people watching.
They'll come over.
I've got to
Are we live?
Yeah, it's on now. I'm gonna do an update posts. So let me see how I can do. I've got to get on YouTube and share the.
Hey, there they go. People are starting to show back up. Yeah. Hit them on X too.
Yeah.
New link.
Let's see here. How you been, dude?
Super busy. It's our busy time at work.
Mm-hmm.
So I work for Association of Christian High Schools, and this is our year end, and I do the CFO stuff. So there's a rush to get people out of school. Then I got to get a whole bunch of stuff done right now before year end, and then but it's kind of a slower time, so I have summer hours for my folks. So it's a little more laid back. I actually can wear shorts to work if I want. I feel like a worship director or something like that.
Let's see. Updated CRC discussion link with. All right. We'll try that. At least on the X.
Nick's back. All right. We got Nick and Chad. We're good.
Nick. Is that Free Rillin's name, Nick?
Yeah.
Who's Nick? I don't know him.
I just doxed him, but I don't care.
Oh,
Nick.
Uh-oh. So yeah, man, we've got some people back here now. We've got more people watching. Yeah, I was just fascinated because I was, knowing your background and like I know that in the years past you and like Jacob keep a pretty like close eye, on the kind of more spicy side of the things that have been going on. But this year's kind of interesting because of that whole like digital church thing that was brought up.
Yeah.
What were your kind of initial thoughts with all that? You kind of reported on it, but then, you could kind of outline what was done, but then kind of give like your thoughts on it.
Yeah, I think I would just say in general. So I've watched the last 4 years every minute, and then I actually went back and watched some previous years. So it had been so contentious in the CRC because it had gotten consumed by, and I'm just going to use clumsy words, but culture war stuff, right? I mean, it's so obvious. And that's why it was interesting, because we've all had to live through that in society, but every other church has had a split over the issue, right? Even the church of my youth, the Methodist church, so we've all dealt with it. So, and they were kind of some of the last ones to deal with it, right? And, he's talked about, and it really is, there's this familial Dutch this kind of ligaments that kind of that has held the CRC together. But as they moved into a more, the funny thing is as they moved into more diversity, what happens is those diverse people end up being fairly traditional, which is kind of interesting. But it was so contentious. And the last 3 years was so dramatic, so painful for many people, right? And quite frankly, the progressive elites put the full court press on over the last 3 years to really try and crank up the emotional, because it was hard for them, but the screws were just like, everything was on an 11, right? And you could just feel the tension. And, it started with the shock that they were in the minority 3 years ago. Then they came back and started forcing some issue stuff and thought that they could just tell more stories or whatever, kind of get the moderates and the Dutch last names on their side to not kick them out. And they kind of forced the issue to basically by installing people or whatever to try and make this happen. And it just was so shocking to them that they were in the 30% of the church, right? And then last year was still kind of the last gasp of trying to implement the decisions, the votes that just kept coming in. And, so you still had that tension last year. And what happened is this year, it felt much more like a business as usual Senate. And I was really struck by that, right? In terms of, there were certainly some things, and we'll get into the virtual church thing, but there certainly were, like in any church context, throw out the junk that they've been arguing about. There's always stuff you don't agree on, right? Like if anybody who's been involved with the church, trust me, there's always stuff that you won't agree on. theologically, or how are we going to do missions, whatever it is. And so just, there was normal stuff going on, but what you could really tell was, and I tweeted this out, is it's very clear the CRC has turned the corner. And all of the kind of ways to game the system or whatever, it was very clear that basically people have accepted, and it was the 70% who voted for this, right, and are basically remaining. I mean, there's still some interesting things that came out, but if I were someone in the CRC, the just the tone, the tenor felt so much more like, okay, you know what I mean? Like, we can get to the business at hand. And there were some cleanup issues, and there were a couple of things that really kind of were some interesting things. I thought something was really interesting that was tonight that is indicative that I think they've got a way to move forward. I think they have a consensus. So tonight they had talked about, there was an overture that basically was trying to just to remove themselves from being in communion with the RCA. Because the RCA, that's one of their really closest, and there's a lot of intertwinement there. And at the constitutional level, they've taken a traditional stance, but they can't enforce down to the local church level.
And that's in their bylaw, because of their bylaws are different.
Just their polity, how it works, right? Yeah. So what happened is there are a lot of RCA churches that are still teaching affirming ideologies, right? And so there was an overture that basically said, hey, guys, and a lot of traditional RCA churches have left over this. So there was the sense of basically trying to push the issue to say, we need to get out of the overture, so we need to get out of communion with them. And there was a majority and a minority report. And what they came back to the floor with tonight was a unified report. And there were still people pushing, and basically they kind of toned the language back in terms of saying, hey, come into repentance. And they also put kind of a 5-year window on it. Yeah, so it was very clear that moderation won the day. And I think what the delegates appreciated was, hey, these folks went in, they had a majority minority report. They somehow found a way to come together, and basically it passed. And so I think most things have been being passed by overwhelming majorities. There were some things that were coming out. So I would say my overall impression was, and this might be the last Synod I watch now, right? I might tune in for some simple things like, the people, like now I know the people because I've been watching Synod for so long, and I enjoy it. And Mr. Vanderploeg goes to Washington. He went back with his passionate evangelism stuff. I love him. But it's really like they're moving on to the next thing. And if I were someone who were in the CRC and I wasn't disaffiliating, I would have taken a lot of comfort in this and almost take a deep breath. It's not like, there aren't big challenges, but it's like that long, arduous fight is over. And so I saw a lot of unity on the floor. And so, but one of the things you talked about is, and then I'll shut up, but one of the things, they had a task force on the virtual church. And, obviously you can see, and the majority report basically said, hey, in person, even if people are doing that, we need to try and get people into in-person environments. They understand the sacramentality, that in person really is where you need to be, but they didn't want to say right now that that's not a church because, we're in this new age. And so, and then obviously there are people that are like, hey guys, like, we know right now that's not a church. Like, how are you going to administer sacraments? Like, and you got to be, so there was, a small minority that was kind of maybe pushing to make that decision now, but the majority report that PVK mentioned as he got up and when he talked was, he probably still is leaning this way, would have thought, yeah, church. And he says, I tell people to go to church. And I, think that church has to be in person. However, he said, I did a video with Jordan Peterson. And then all of a sudden, this community that we call this little corner has come around us, and he's doing estuary. So he liked
and there's people that support Living Stones, that support him through the ministry of Living Stones, and by product or by proxy supports the CRC. There's like investment, But I think the most interesting thing to me is kind of, well, two things. For one, to see that institution play, because the CRC is so small as a denomination. Are we talking like 150,000? Or are we talking what it's?
And I think that, I don't know if these numbers are correct now, but Mr. Vanderplug mentioned there's they're somewhere between 180 and 200,000.
Yeah. So I mean, that is a small community, but it's an official mainline, and they function as an institution, and so it's small enough to like that you can kind of, like you said, you can get to know these people over watching them online, like, and I know you like sports too, so there's also that kind of like thing, but you also like procedure, probably, as someone with a law background and that kind of stuff too. It's like, but I think that's kind of an interesting way, because then it goes to, okay, well, let's talk about digital church, and we're going to do a task force for that. And we're just in evangelicalism, and you may know this too. It's like a task force. Isn't that already figured out? Isn't this already happening? Like, but I was almost like, oh, they're going to take their time to make, and the Catholic Church does similar thing. It's like that's almost like a forgotten art in the speed of the internet. Is that you're going to like really measure something. You're going to put a team together, and we're going to trust these people within the institution. And so I think that is that's interesting.
I think it's wise. I think one of the, so let's just say, I'm a lawyer. I also advise boards and stuff like that. So I did resolutions and minutes and procedure and stuff. So yeah, I'm a nerd who kind of knows some of that stuff. But one of the things that I think, which is really interesting, is that they don't move. They certainly don't move as quickly as a non-denominational would, right?
Yeah.
We make a decision, we go, like, we got our PowerPoints, we've got our plan, we'll launch it next quarter, right? So, and because it moves, I think there's an advantage to how slowly the CRC does move. And in the end, it probably, I think, had they brought some of this human sexuality stuff up and it had come to the floor in full, maybe 2012, 13,
yeah,
14,
a decade before it hit. Yeah, before
it might have passed.
Yeah.
But what happened was the time started to happen, and the more moderate people who were probably maybe more open to that started to see, oh, wait a minute, this stuff's not working out great. You know what I mean? For human beings, right?
Yeah.
And I think the slowness of it, and really the CRC is one of the last ones to tackle this. And things have changed in the United States particularly. There has been a sea change away from cancel culture, some of that stuff. So it's interesting, the slowness with which they moved, in some ways from the progressive elite, that they would probably rue that day. But I think what it did is gave them some time to see how these radically new ideas are worked out in people's lives, to where you had someone like a Paul Vanderklay. He calls himself a self-described lefty, right? And a moderate, and someone who very much would have never wanted to be in a situation where he thought his friends of lifetimes and generations would feel like they would need to disaffiliate. But someone like him could see that and go, whoa, I think we need to be very careful here. And so I do think it's smart to think about something. It's like the Amish, like they don't reject technology out of hand. When some new technology comes, they look at it. How will this affect the community? How will this affect our spiritual life? If it needs to be like, not used, we won't use it, or we'll use it, but we'll put limitations. It's like this really healthy relationship with new things. And so I do think that the stance that had been taken is, I agree with the people, and this is even before orthodoxy, anything. Like my buddy and I, who are Plows church planners, he mentored a lot of guys, and he was meeting with a guy ahead of time, and I heard the last 10 minutes. He was creating a completely online, they were going to do an online church. This Mega did the spinoff, and everyone was going to meet online. It was going to be all online. And he walked away. He goes, "What do you think about that?" I'm like, "That's not church." But, and like Paul mentioned, I don't think it's true. I don't think church has to be incarnational, has to be embodied. And then if sacraments are a part of it, like if you're going to do sacramentality every week, you can't do that at home. You have to do that and like for them, ministers of the word have to give the sacrament. They hold that. And so, but I mean, we're in a world of people growing up on Screams Christian, and I
Yeah.
mean the things out of the barn. I mean, there have been Protestants that are doing fully online church stuff, man, and they don't have any problem with it. Now,
Yeah. Well, that's the I think that's I've kind of put my stake in the ground on that, as far as like I do think like my wife, she recorded a thing for grad school, and we did a mock counseling session in my studio here. And like I really kind of I have the same kind of tension with how at this church that I'm a part of, how much I want technology to be visible, to be applicable, and I have a lot of reservation. But I'm the guy that does all the tech, like and so my wife's like, what is your deal? Like, why are you this guy with like LED lights and, control? And I was like, well, because I'm coming to my conclusion is that these two things have two different, depending on kind of your doctrine and your theology, they have two different telos, like, and if it is just, I think that, and this goes back to I remember the first time that Jeremy, what's Jeremy's last name that does the Saints with over on Grail Country. Yeah, he was like, the Matrix is totally about like Gnosticism. And now I kind of see, like, to me, this is such like a Gnostic reality. Everything we talk about on here is ideas. Everything is disembodied. Everything is, and you don't need, and if you don't have a kind of, honestly, a strong incarnational doctrine and theology, it's easily to just be, to remain as just an idea. And so I think that is going to be a big question over the next 5 years, especially, but I've already kind of come to that conclusion for myself. Like, we can play in this space. There's real relationships that are built, but even those, like, they're way more ephemeral on here. Like, everyone, when you drop back into your life and you're having to deal with these bodies and this matter, like, it is more difficult. It's more slow, and it's more painful in a way. And here it can kind of be like, hey, buddy, I haven't seen you in like 4 months, but hey, we're back. The speed of the internet. And so, yeah. Anyways, that's kind of how I feel about that as well. And
well, I think you're relating. So one of the Calvin theology professors basically brought up the Gnostic point too. He's like, it's, and I would just say what they passed is, I mean, very much if you look at what they passed, they understand and probably are leaning 80% that a church has to be an embodied incarnational thing. And clearly using digital tools for outreach and communication and stuff like that, like that's great for a local church. So I think that's if you were to ask them if they had to make a decision today, they would have overwhelmingly said church needed to be done in person. But I think it is this sense that they're trying to figure out what it is. And again, if you were to ask Paul today, he still tells people to go to church, right? And he understands estuary is not church, right? And so, but it's a different thing. But I think Paul's deliberate and likes to observe and wants to see what that looks like. But for me, I never really realized and didn't put this together. I have two very highly relational things that I deal with. Well, family, but a 12-step recovery group and in church, right? And so I had these very embodied, deeply connected, relational, in a context I've been highly honest, like sort of like take your mask off sort of a situation. And that's good for me because I'm in recovery. Like if I get lost and if I get Gnostic, I'll end up in bad places. Like I need to be connected to people that look at me and say, hey, you're not doing well. What's going on here? No, I'm fine. They're like, no. You're definitely not fine. What's going on? Like you need in some ways you need that. And so, I think the meaning crisis largely that we're dealing with, we've all talked about, it's honest, it's a lack of community. It's a
Yeah.
lack of human connection.
Yeah.
And I'm very reticent to, I'm very reticent that, um, of online, like if you think that you can do church primarily online. Because I mean, but that's one of the things, which is like, yes, you can give a good like you can. I watch online sermons. I did even when I'm not going to church. Like you can give a good sermon, and you can listen to great worship music, you know. And so those parts of the service you can absolutely do online, but you certainly can't do sacraments online.
Yeah. Well, and you can't. I mean, you can't breathe the same air, you know, and I think that there's like a parachurch is there real ministry that happens through the internet. I mean, all of that, but I can't see how, if you don't have a certain theology of tradition, I don't see how you don't just. I don't see what holds you back from. I already think that if a church is content first in their approach to what they're doing on, say, Sunday morning, that you're already like, your head's already left your body.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that's part of what I'm thinking about related to all that. And the other part of it is like, even with the idea of, this tension, I think that within the CRC is like, and with a lot of even the main lines themselves, because I saw a stat the other day, like, I don't know if it's a stat I heard, like, so the conservatives won the vote in the United Methodist, but then like the conservatives basically left and started the Global Methodists, but only a certain percentage of the churches that left actually went to the Global Methodists. Some of them just became independent evangelical churches because that was they didn't even see like the necessity.
They were so disillusioned by dominant denomination. Like one of the things,
partly, but they also were so enamored by like evangelicalism as well. Like, so you're like, why do I even need this institution? And I can just kind of be in this, follow these digital trends in this certain way, and be in that, like Paul said, that market of ideas. And so I think that
we're awash in it, right? And it's you don't even realize how consumed by it you are, right? Like this whole kind of consumption, and here we are on YouTube, right? And I think you can use things for good or for bad, but it's a whole other thing. And I think I'll tell you, one of the things that, having watched, I had left the Methodist Church before. It was the stuff was starting to rumble, but then I did pay attention to synods and stuff like that. And there were some weird things about how cities had a lot more power, just how it was structured. Smaller groups of people could grab the power, and then they were, basically taking people's property. It was a mess, right? It was awful. And it was so big that it allowed let's just say the normal culture war stuff to just be raw and rough. The one thing that so in many ways, the CRC has punched above its weight class. Like they've always been a small denomination, but they've had people break out to kind of become leaders, reformed leaders and authors and thinkers and stuff like that. It's pretty impressive. And then, one of the things I've just gained a respect for in terms of that is, that struggle they went through, but they forced themselves into the family forced themselves into the room. And because there was the familial ties and it got raw, they still handled it with a more measured response than what we saw in some of these other split ups, Christian, So I've gained a lot of respect for how the CRC does things. Like and then particularly as I've seen now that they're on the other side, because, some of the more conservative elements did not get the overtures and the things they wanted passed there this week. So it's not like there was this rush to all this stuff. it was a more measured and moderate, and even though they weren't quote unquote, having maybe all the things they wanted, there wasn't an anger like kind of once things got to a point to where people realized where it was going, they'd kind of vote overwhelmingly together in many ways, right? It was really pretty. I've been impressed, but part of that is because I think the familial ties he talked about. What's more incarnational than a family, right? I mean, embodied. You talk about embodied, like the kids come out of your wife's body, and then you help make. You did your little part. Like
part.
You did your little part, and then you do more. But then once they're born, then that's when the fun hits for dads. But at any rate, yeah, and again, as I look back on this and having seen the pain that they went through, I would just say that as an outsider looking in, that incarnational, that familial thing, although it did require a split, it did. That in the end, that group who came together, I think they probably did it about as well as you could do it.
And you're talking about the CRC?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Like the split over human sexuality.
Right.
As tough as that was, I think they did it about as well as you could do it.
Yeah, because it's a human process. It's just so interesting. I was in a situation over a decade ago, and we had a pastor come in, and he was like, "I want this to be like Silicon Valley. I want ideas to just happen and go and and it's like move fast and break things, And you really, when I think about that now, like I'm kind of we have so much power, and even more now with AI. To just and I struggle with it in myself because I want to move fast in certain ways too, but the speed of human, the most that humans can meet in real life easily is like around a table is once a week, maybe, and with like a leadership team that's trying to, but even some of our meetings, like some people tune in through Zoom, I've been on the road before too. And so there's I've lived both sides of this. I guess I'm old enough now to have lived both, to have considered, and I see, and it's hard to see this when you're younger, but I guess, but with there being a contingency of young people that are looking to these grand institutions like historical churches and everything, this is kind of what you're signing up for, is some slow, deliberate moves, and I think that there's a remembering that is I don't know.
Well, one of the things that Sam and Paul have said for years, and I get it, and they talk about the Protestants adapt quickly. And so they're going to see this. And so, by the way, if people want liturgy and they want communion, they'll be doing liturgy and communion, they'll adapt quickly. And I think that's true. Businesses need to adapt quickly. And so I came up basically in the 90s, I was in my 20s, and that's with the Hybels and the PowerPoint church and the business church and strategies and plans. I fit into so even when I got into church planning, I fit into that world really well because that's what I did for a living. I was good at it, right?
Yeah.
And so, man, I can put a great PowerPoint, and we'll have this 3-5-point plan, and we'll and you went in and you did all that stuff. I actually think that the adaptability of Protestantism has, and particularly the quick adaptability, has shown to be, quite frankly, what's happened in the 70s since we've had women's ordination and feminism. And I'm ready to have that conversation. If you look at the decline of a lot of things, it ties a lot to that. Birth rate collapse, churches starting to, I'm just going to say that's an interesting thing. That's a third rail people don't want to touch. But I think some of this adaptability then that happens, people immediately adapted into affirming stances and trying to match culture and seeker. I think the adaptability is ultimately what's caused the dramatic collapse of the church. Because they adapted so quickly to the secular atheist culture that we'd been consumed in. And so they'll try to adapt to another thing. But if you're adapting, you know what Gen Z is tired of?
Yeah.
In many ways, adapting. Like, no, we want. Paul said something that was really good. Is he had mentioned when people had talked like of a younger generation, they're like, guys, you got rid of all of our roots. Like, so the boomers got rid of all the roots. They progressed. We moved from civil rights to women's rights they just kept chugging along to every new. They had to have their new thing to protest and whatever, and they threw away everything of their prior generations for the most part, right? And I can just say that my kids who are Gen Z, 26 down to 19, they're all just. And by the way, my stepdaughter would be definitely a very liberal girl, right? So politically, those things don't get whatever, but they know that everybody's full of BS. The news, the politicians, the promise, like all this stuff, like they all know it's complete and utter BS.
Yeah.
And they're looking for something of substance.
Yeah. I think that, we are in the, we are now in the full throes of the experiment, and it's and now beyond that, seeing the kind of outcome and consequences of. I'm gonna go ahead. I'm gonna open it up. I appreciate
Sure.
you like giving the big picture, and I'm gonna see if anyone else wants to come in tonight. I can't remember if Free Reeling was saying he was gonna somebody.
Well, and so here I'll say this, like,
Yeah, go
I
for
found
it.
myself in traditional church as people are coming in. Listen, in house church, but even like the small country churches out from where I grew up or whatever, I'm just telling you, a lot of Protestant churches did embodied, relational, deep, connected well. They did. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And they didn't get tossed to and fro. And particularly if you go to a small town church, like one thing you find out if you grew up in a small town, there are people that you like and dislike in a small town, but you have to get along with, you really kind of have to get along with everyone because you got to come together in a small town. You got to be on the volunteer fire department. Your daughter may end up marrying the other family's son or what, like that stuff just happens. And you have to, it almost is like it just forces people to kind of have to get along.
Yeah, it does. And because you have to depend on people like you're saying, and you have to see them in the hospital, you have to see them at the gas station and Walmart and everywhere else. Yeah.
And it's really hard to hide in a small church. This is why a lot of people don't like doing so here's one of the biggest reasons people don't like doing house church. You can't hide or slip in and out real easy.
Yeah.
Like because if there's 5 families getting together and 2 don't show up, like that's a big deal. Like, you know what I mean? Like, yep. And so you kind of feel obligated and so it's hard to want to like be real relational because it's,
well, and that's the antidote though, unfortunately. I mean, it's hard for me. I mean, it's but I do think it's the antidote. It's a big part of the antidote is allowing yourself to be known in such a way and to consider trying to know others and encourage, I think, what was it? Free Willing up here, he said, I actually hate going to church. I do it for my children because I die in isolation. But the key is to realize there's no loving Christ's whole self body without loving randos in the pew. So.
Amen.
Yeah.
Did you share the link?
Yeah, I did. It's sometimes people don't come in on the late. I've got the link here, guys. I need to pin it. See if anyone wants to come in. Most people are sitting around in their boxers and whatever.
Well, so one of the things that was interesting, and I thought about this and I put it together, we're talking about relational, we're talking about community. A lot of people talk about neighborhood churches. That's been a buzzword for a long time, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, one of the buildings is a church in Midtown Kansas City, and we were basically, a friend of mine was given the building by a dying church, right? But there was no parking lot because they didn't need a parking lot because everyone just walked to the church from the neighborhood. And then there was a church 2 blocks. There were churches all over the place, and so there was a time, and even in a big city, people still like, and then the churches weren't that big either. So they had a lot more neighborhood churches. There was a Dunbar number, right?
Yep.
And so a pastor could really like shepherd
Yeah.
the 150 people that came to his church.
Yeah.
So
It's
now I'm sure that was different in big cathedrals and big cities or whatever, but this is just the suburbs of Kansas City, right outside the downtown. So I bet if you went into Chicago, I bet people could walk to their churches back in the. I bet if I walked around, I'd notice that you could probably walk to those churches, and those churches probably weren't that big.
Yeah, dude, we moved into a 150 seat pew church, you know, and it's a mile and a half from my house. My son's like, "We could walk here, Dad." It's like, yeah, you're right. It's one of the most amazing, exciting things. Nick, what's up, man? Thanks for putting on the shirt and hopping online. What?
I'm disappointed he put the shirt on.
What?
At least it's a wife beater.
What's been going through your mind, dude?
Can you guys hear me?
Yeah, you're good.
Well, on the virtual church note, because I happened to be tuning in during that whole section of Synod. Like if I were just to have read the majority report and minority report, like without any of the interaction, I probably would have voted minority. But after hearing everyone talk about it, and this is one thing several people in there pointed out. They're like, and especially Paul, like, listen, guys, we don't have to figure out all of the trauma that has happened and that will happen, that might happen, with a bunch of rules. Like, there's going to be more synods. We are all here. We can figure it out. We trust each other. So let's not codify what we can figure out through interacting with each other.
Well, that's good.
And that was the vibe of the synod, for sure, which is like, do not codify something that you don't have, that can be figured out with just talking face to face. You know, and that was different with human sexuality, because I mean, this is one of the points that the Abide, not even the Abide guys, really, like the 70% crowd was making, is that this is incompatible. And where a lot of the stuff discussed today wasn't necessarily right away incompatible. And in fact, they said, hey, it might be, let's take some time and figure it out. But anyway, as they kept talking about it and discussing on the floor, I was like, you know what, I think I'm down with the majority report, like, because the majority report could turn into the minority report in 5 years. Basically, for anyone who didn't catch that part, majority was like, and minority were very close. Both the reports, they both said, like, we really we're like, online ministry is good. We encourage online gathering as much as possible. That you need to go get the sacraments in person. The main difference is majority said, let's table whether or not we're going to say online church isn't real. Again, not ministry, but church. Let's discuss further and decide down the line. Minority said, actually, right now, let's just say you can't be an online church because you can't baptize online, right? But there's a lot of discussions to be had. But on that, like with communion, because some of the people I think in CRC are like, you could do virtual communion. I would guess more than half maybe were like, nah.
Oh, yeah, I think probably 80% probably are not. Yeah.
But yeah, so as they talked, I was probably with majority, and that's probably where I would have voted. But towards the end, they kept getting these people from, like, and a lot of them were from the young adults representatives. A lot of comments on the floor, like, ignore what's in the reports, because the reports make a distinction between ministry and church. And so people would get on the floor and be like, you know, because, you know, some people have agoraphobia or whatever, like, we shouldn't judge them, and we should, like, you know, make room for online spaces. This is the only way some people can interact. It's like, both reports said that's great. Like, you know, you should do that. But people kept making this. It was like the only taste of previous synods from the past 4 years of, like, empathy. Here's this empathetic case, therefore you should do this thing. Once those people got on the floor, I was like, you guys are gonna make me change my mind to minority all over again. But anyway, that was my my observations from listening to that this morning or afternoon. I forget which one it was.
So the test case of like why it should be church is to try to like for the marginalized.
Yes.
Versus, is there something real that can happen through the internet? That's a bigger question than it's just for the marginalized as a ministry. Paul's is more of like a medical, like a Holy Spirit question of like, what's going on through the cable,
right.
Like what is that these things end up in real life. And that's what it seemed like to me. I just caught the little snippet. I don't remember if it was, I think Phoebus posted the clip, and CW sent me a text, and it was but yeah, it is. It's a good question though, because I think it's just good that they're having like a conversation and a deliberation about it, as opposed to it doesn't matter. Let's just move at the speed of, I don't know. That's the
well, and then,
it's interesting.
And that's one of the things that I notice is like, and it is the Protestant church is going to have to tackle this, and particularly as people get further sucked into screens and we're becoming further atomized. This is going to be a really big conversation for the Protestant church to have. Like the Orthodox church is just not a conversation, because you have to go to the liturgy, and the Eucharist is like the priest, as soon as like they did it for COVID and he shut it off, he's like, I'm not doing these online services anymore, because you have to come to church. Like that's what we do, right?
I love that it's pressing the issue, honestly.
Yeah.
Like because I think that's that question with the Synod. I love that the issue is getting pressed. I think we have to contend with it, because I think it goes. I mean, someone it may have been you, Free Will, and you said that Christian. What did you say? I was flirting with Rome or something in the comments. Somebody said. But the thing is, we have to contend with what has happened when things moved to writing, like, and the ideas, like things slowly moved, and that you don't see it in the 15 to 17, 18, 19. You don't see it because there's still so much embodied reality, but now you see it. It's so much more clear and stark what it means to like put on some headphones and talk into a mic and like turn on a camera and be like, okay, this is kind of interesting and fun, but is this what it means to gather together to worship God?
Well, and so I think, and even I can't remember what it is, but in terms of even literacy in the United States, Christian, I think it was World War I. Like only 30%, and I need to find this stat. I've seen it at least a couple of times, but it's roughly something like this. That well, actually, guys, you can put the real numbers down there, but you get what I'm saying. Only 30% of the soldiers could sign their name. Most of them could just do an X. So that's in the early 1900s. So it's really very new that we're reading, and then all of a sudden, when you be, every man a theologian, like, no, wait a minute, whoa, like, that's a little. There's that sense that I grew up in that sense, and I felt as a Christian man, I needed to be in massive Bible study at all points. I needed to understand it. You know what I mean? Like there was this sense, and as soon as you get into your head and reading and thinking, it takes it away from, even in Protestant expressions was very embodied, right? And so so most of those guys were Protestants who also couldn't read, men and women. What were they doing? They were going to church, and they were hearing the Bible. This is in Protestant sense. They were hearing the Bible at church, but they were singing hymns. They were having meals. They were coming back for second service. They were doing all sorts of stuff that was very embodied, right? Mm-hmm. And so, it took a while for the printing press, because people couldn't read. It started it, but really it's been the last century really is where we've undergone this mass change, and it's we're still catching up to this stuff. Like we don't adapt like human beings. Like we don't adapt that quickly, with those sorts of things. And I think we're all wrestling with it.
Any thoughts, Nick?
Yeah, my mind started to wander to like random internet places of like, most people shouldn't be literate, like random takes you see on Twitter, because I'm thinking like, okay, is there something to people who don't need to be literate? Um, this is a wild take, I know, but
I'll go with you.
but
Maybe we should not learn not
if
to
you
read.
don't know how to read or write, when you show up on Sunday, you're probably absorbing things way better, you know? Like there's something wrong with my brain. I can't focus through even the readings of scripture on Sunday. Like I get lost every time. I'm like, I'm going to do this. My mind gets lost because it's right there. Like it's like remembering phone numbers, right? Like once you have the ability to like have it in your phone, you don't remember phone numbers anymore. It's like that with the bulletin, or like with being able to read and look up the lectionary on the internet. It's like something in my brain is just like, dude, take a break. You don't need to pay attention to this. Or like if your sermon recordings on YouTube, which I guess is more of a technological statement than like a literacy statement. But that's where my brain went when Lance was talking about, the good old days walking to church. And we do walk to church when the weather's nice. Our church is like 3/4 of a mile away. So fun fact.
You just have all these humble brags and flexes you pull out all the time, Nick, and it's really impressive.
Yeah. Well, yeah.
You beat my 1.5 miles. So like so what are you saying? Like, I don't know if I quite understand exactly what you were saying about.
Yeah, I don't either.
Would we be better? No, so what Nick was talking about. So one of the things, particularly when you're new, I think it's good, but you'll see a lot of people in Orthodox churches, certain places, certain is not it, but they'll be on their phones, they'll be following along with the liturgy. Like, because there's a lot, if you're there for 3 hours, there's all this stuff that's going on and they're reading and chanting things. And one of the things my priest told me early on, and it made a lot of sense, which he's like, I understand, it's good to like, every now and again, you want to read, you want to follow it, you want to figure some things out. But he says, at least half the time, I don't want you to be reading or anything. Look up. Like, turn it around, quit trying to, because he knew me, quit trying to study everything and trying to learn it, figure it all out. He said, just look up and you'll get what you'll get, and your mind will wander. That's fine. Look around, pay attention, and be here, And it made a lot. I was kind of doing that a little bit myself. I found myself the first liturgy I went to, I was trying to pay attention a lot of it, and then I just put the book down and I just watched. Because I realized I wasn't to catch anything, and that's when I quite frankly had a bit of a Holy Spirit moment. But I mean, you go back to it, which is this, we're not going to turn the page back, but would we be better off if people couldn't read? I mean, that's a really interesting question, Nick.
I'm looking at Skankenstein's comment. I saw someone in church the other day with a dual screen smartphone Bible on the left screen, Dragon Ball Z muted on the right. Be here, dude. Just be here. Don't be on Cartoon Network. Oh my gosh, that's awesome.
Well, so here's another thing I would think about this. So Nick, you just said something. I just thought about this. Now that we've read and we're trying to figure everything out and everything else, you had to listen a lot more back then, right, Nick? And we talk about that. Like the art of actually listening in almost every contest and paying attention to your surroundings to figure it out. Were people potentially better listeners before all of this, before we got locked up in our heads?
Oh yeah, for sure.
Yeah, attention. Yeah, knowing how to hold attention towards something sacred, something reverent. Yeah, I mean, we almost don't want to. It's like, because we're so bad at it, I think that there's a temptation of like, we should make it to where that's not as important, so we all feel okay with ourselves, because it's so hard to keep that kind of attention for an hour or whatever. The two liturgies I went to, the second one I think I was exhausted and overwhelmed. I did cry during the Orthodox liturgy as they read the story of because it was one of the only parts of the service they did in English at this Romanian. I sit next to Paul Vanderklay, and like reading the story of the prodigal son made me weep. It was an interesting experience just to hear the word. I didn't have a Bible open, but it's obviously a story I've known for basically my whole life. But And I do think like you can't. There's also something about like trying to make something novel every week. Like, well, that can't get into your bones. You're not going to be able to like take something in over time if it's always different. If there's nothing here to kind of hold on to that's the same. And I guess like Nick, you said you go to Anglican church, so I mean y'all are on the lectionary and so obviously the Divine Liturgy changes like what 3 times a year. I don't know how often it changes, but anyways, yeah, I think there's something to all of that, and it kind of goes back into this kind of speed, this kind of human speed of like even this institution like the CRC with their we're gonna deliberate over this over the next. We're gonna take a year. We're gonna take a few years or whatever it is. Who takes a year to think about anything anymore? Like, I mean, like, I'm gonna think about this. Who takes even just like the act of like I'm gonna think about this for Lent. That seems like a long time to think about something, and I think that even like scaling down practices to something like that is probably really helpful. I don't know. Would y'all have any other thoughts? I wasn't paying that close attention, and I want to encourage anybody else that wants to come in for a minute. If anyone wants to hang out, in their late night boxers or whatever. But
Lance,
Lance,
what happened tonight? I didn't catch a lot from the evening session.
So tonight, there was an overture basically saying that they wanted to basically go to the RCA and be like, we can't be in communion anymore.
Oh yeah,
because you've got too many of your churches and you can't control them, and we can't be in communion. We made this decision, and there was a majority and a minority report that had come out, and one was wanting more urgent kind of like, hey guys, we can't be you can't control what's going on. We can't be affiliated. We can't be in communion with you because you have clearly openly affirming ideology churches. What came back was though is the majority and minority report, they synced it into one, and basically what they said was they toned some of the rhetoric down because there was some rhetoric about calling them into repentance and stuff, and they're like, whoa. We don't want to go in with that posture. They kind of know the issue they're dealing with, and they kind of are going to have some conversations, but they wanted to give it at least like 5 years. So you said like the 1 year, like when you were just saying like, oh, how are we going to wait for 1 year? And I think was really interesting, Nick, is what happened was, and it was fairly overwhelmingly approved, even though I understand what people were talking about, which is because the more conservative churches were leaving, and a lot of people were saying, hey, we're going to have to deal with this faster than 5 years because we just dealt with this and we just came out of this tumult. But they passed what I would say was a very moderate. Yes, we know we're probably heading towards getting out of communion with them, but because we're so intertwined, let's take a little time with this. We're good here. We've made our decision. We're all on the same page.
Yeah.
Approach this with a little more caution. And so, I found myself after listening tonight, I would have voted with the majority. And part of what I think the reason why I also would have voted was they got rid of the majority and minority report and came together on a unified report. So when I see people of divergent opinions coming together and saying, okay, let's take one thing to the floor, they went back and reworked it. I was just moved to be like, hey, if they could come into some sort of, agreement, I can too. Right.
Mm-hmm.
So
yeah.
It was probably some of the most, nothing really got us, and it wasn't as heated, but the most spirited conversations, I think this was one of them that's happened tonight.
I don't know the finer points on the RCA polity, but do you know if there's like wiggle room in their bylaw, or are they just more congregational?
They basically, the way their constitution works, effectively, let's just use the word synod as their synod can't reach down and tell the local church what to do, inevitably, in terms of disciplining pastors and stuff. It really, so what does it do? The power is really, really down at the local level, right? And so although they passed at their constitutional level, marriage between a man and a woman, kind of the traditional stances, they didn't have the means, whereas, the CRC did, which was to hold office bearers and pastors and churches, they could bring, try to bring them into alignment And if they didn't, there were, means by which they could discipline. So that's the difference, is that the RCA just doesn't have that ability to do that. And so
it's less of an authoritative polity. But they have like almost similar theology, I guess, is why they're in such close communion.
And the RCA is in it now, right? So they kind of have this situation where they can't force people to do things, but we know the tension that church is living in right now, right? So it's an incompatible view. So they're in a very difficult situation, and part of it is like, who knows how this is going to work out in 5 years? It might end up being the RCA ends up moving, somehow being able to move in full alignment, and the RCA ends up taking a stance that's in line with the confessions of the CRC, or it may remain this weird thing, and maybe a bunch of the conservative churches will leave, which means then it might even pass to be an affirming church, and if that would happen, so who knows how it's going to work out. But again, my overarching thing was, I feel good for the people in the CRC that the tumult is over. They have fairly broad consensus on that issue, and they can now start moving forward on a lot of other things, because they got I mean, their membership is been declining rapidly.
The RCA
money issues, the CRC.
Oh,
But that's not on. But every mainline church is dealing with that. Like the Lutheran church, like they're all dealing with it. And so, in many ways, churches like the CRC, if they don't turn things around, there'll be a remnant. They're not going to go away. But man, budgets become real tough. What you can do, closing down churches. I mean, they're up against it like every other mainline church. I mean, they got bigger fish to fry that they need to start focusing on. And I think they finally put all the human sexuality stuff behind them.
Do you mean like mission and like church planning and stuff, or like what is the bigger fish that would?
Well, the simple thing is if you have a rapidly decline, if your church is rapidly declining, and you're a denomination, and denominations take a lot of money to support a denomination, and denominations are amazing. Like losing the vocational pastor, the crisis that's creating, so pastors get a lot of support and training, not just accountability, like all the stuff, and then it's so if you're a vocational pastor, like the Methodist church I went to, they would cycle through pastors, but if the pastor had an affair, you know what happened? You went to your same Methodist church and they would bring a new pastor in. You didn't have to leave the church. Non-denominational church, the head rock star pastor who brings in 4,000 people on a weekend, he has the affair. Maybe you can find a guy as good as the rock star pastor, maybe not. Ends up splitting, and so at any rate, plus vocational pastors, you provide them a parsonage, and there's a little bit of a pension, and you can kind of support your family. Like it's tough out there trying to be if you're not an omega with a bunch of money, it's tough out there just trying to survive. And they're trying to push all these pastors into being bivocational. It's burnout city. Very few people can do bivocational well, because you have this heart, like the church never stops. There's always something you should be doing, and they need you. And if you're bivocational, somebody still calls you at 10 o'clock at night because there's a crisis, and you're the bivocational pastor, you're going to deal with it. Mm-hmm. Then you got to work, and you got to figure out how you're going to make money. And you're not spending full time on that. Like, you have to be like a kick butt 1% entrepreneur to be a really good bivocational pastor.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, that begs the sort of not even elephant in the room for Synod, but as I'm watching things unfold, it still doesn't have a concrete identity, the CRC, and it probably hasn't for like 50. I don't know. I mean, PVK would speak to this better, but it's like, what is the CRC now, right? It's not explicitly Dutch Reformed. It has a Dutch Reformed heritage, but it's not really leaning into that because it's multi-ethnic now. So that's just its heritage. But like, what's going to keep this thing going? You know?
Well, I think what's interesting related to that, I mean, for one, Jonathan Peugeot's conversation with Winston, what's his name? English guy that used to be in Mumford's and Sons. He's got a podcast now. Anyways, they talk. I mean, this whole question of identity is huge because, I was just thinking, in the Presbyterian world that I'm newly a part of, there's like Korean Presbyterians, like,
Oh yeah.
and it's a huge thing. Like, Presbyterian is like the biggest Christian denomination in South Korea, I think. And there's a ethnic, and they're developing their own ethos of Presbyterianism around their distinctive culture. And I mean the thing that people don't necessarily want to say out loud a lot of times is just the Protestant Anglo, whether it's Anglo or European histories or whatever related, just talking about the Dutch. So much of what it, like, what is the CRC? Well, like, why did it turn out and become what it is? Partially because of its Dutchness. Like, it is, and I think that we have to get into a place where we somehow can be okay with talking in those terms without it, turning into a big nasty name call. To be able to look at, yes, Quarter Korean Presbyterian Church. That's mine, Presbyterian Church. But like, it being able to be like, well, it's probably like this because it came from this, and maybe we instead of it just becoming into the, like you said, and I think one of the questions I've heard recently was like through Phlebas or Paul was like, no, we want to be more confessional than liturgical, or there was like this conversation of going between being held together by confession or liturgy without acknowledging, I guess certain confessions are related to like places, but acknowledging that part of the distinctive nature of how we got like what has been binding was, ethnic heritage. It's
Yeah.
It's a
And
real
look at
issue.
it. So one of the interesting things is that, so if you look on their CRCNA website, right, it says, where do we come from? So, and that this language was pushed by the more progressive elements, which are now leaving, right? Historically, we came from the Netherlands, but today, although a majority of our members are still from Dutch backgrounds, we can't honestly be called a Dutch church unless we're also called a Korean church, a Navajo church, a South Asian church, a French Canadian church, a Hispanic American church, an African American church, a Mosaic church. So, and again, if you look at the growth, I would bet, I don't know, but I gleaned enough from whatever, a lot of their growth is kind of happening with the Koreans. And so quite frankly, if like the denomination is going to grow or have people show up where it can fund itself, it's not going to happen from the Dutch, right? But so basically they wanted to not be called these things, but quite frankly, the 70% of those people are showing up. The Koreans were voting traditional. African American, like we've noticed in the past 2 or 3 years, the brown people were voting traditional, while the scolds were calling them like one thing you didn't hear, and I went back like 5 or 6 years, there was no misogynistic, xenophobic rate, like the buzzwords were being used all over the Senate floor over the previous years. You didn't hear a single one of those buzzwords come out on the Senate floor. But when you move to that, like they just called themselves, which is true, they are all those things. It's just going to be very different. And what attracts people, what you'll see it, and this was last year, is what's attracting people to the CRC, if they're of a different ethnicity, is they like the traditional confessions of the church. They're coming for the Reformed theology. Mm-hmm. And then the other thing is, like, Koreans are rule followers, man. Like, you know what I mean? Like, this is awesome. I've got a good friend that grew up Korean family, whatever. Man, boom, like, we follow the rules, man. Like, there's no slack when it comes to that. And so if there's a rule, like the Word of God says this or confession says this, like, Where are we even talking about here, guys? Why are we? There's no black and white here. It says this. We're going to do this.
Did you have a thought, Nick, or did you black out? No, he's gone. See you, dude. He might come back on something else. Anyways, yeah, it is. I think that's another interesting question about what is the CRC related to such things, and it probably they are popping up, and obviously because of Paul, there's like a level of salience within this corner of the internet, but my phone is special, but there's also that question of what makes something, something. And that's like, even like in the Orthodox Church, you have Rokor and Greek and Antioch. You have these cultural, Romanian, you have all these cultural things, and they carry heritage and they carry identity and they carry, and, even though America is supposed to be like, well, there is no X, Y, and Z, but I mean, that's ignoring the, Italian and the Irish Catholics and the Protestants and the Episcopalians, and like, that's ignoring all of that, and that the Episcopalians were all English, and that, like, it's ignoring all of that. Mm-hmm. And I think that that's just something that needs, and like that's case where the Korean Presbyterian Church created their own, like, kind of like sidebar of Presbyterianism to, mm-hmm. I was driving through Nashville, and I saw a steeple, and I was asking my sister, I was like, what church is that? And she's like, look on Google. And it was the Korean Presbyterian. They had their own Korean, like, downtown parish. There was the Korean Anglican Church, and then there was the Korean Baptist Church. They had their own, like, in Brentwood, Tennessee, outside of Nashville. It was like they had their own version of American Mainline, like, mm-hmm. and no one's asking them to not be Korean. Like,
right. Yeah.
So
one of the things that this goes back to your Gnosticism thing or whatever, and to some extent, I think if the ideas are what are drawing people, and this, I know I'm trying to stay out of these sorts of conversations, but if you're attracted mainly because of the ideas and what someone believes versus the embodied practice community of the church, I think those are two different things. And I do think that, and I would just say this, I'm old enough. I think a lot more Protestants, it was more a part of their life. It was a way of life. And even when I hear something like the CRC, you had first service, then you went back for second service, right? And then you went to the schools. Like it was a whole thing that engrossed you. And yes, it was based on Reformed theology, but that's not what bound the people that grew up in those churches and those families. You know what I'm talking? It was different than I'm showing up for the ideas. And so that's why when we get back to the virtual church, which is Gnostic element of it. And I think if anybody's interested, I felt like Paul's conversation with Aaron Briesman, who was a part of the Abide Project last year, because Paul keeps talking about we got to have this confessional conversation. And this goes back to what Luke keeps hammering all the time, personalism versus confessionalism or whatever. And, Paul's making a good point, and Aaron Briesman agreed, but he's like, even in this church right now that has kind of come together, at least the 70% is remaining. And so there's some agreement around, let's just say, the human sexuality stuff. But he mentioned it's really hard to have confessional conversations right now because we're so atomized. Every person's their own theologian, right? The submitting to, so it's hard to have, because really, in many ways, confessions, not solely, so please, I'm not trying to offend anyone. They're not solely ideas, but they are ideas and definite, you know what I mean? And so it's very hard, and we're just becoming more and more atomized every day, right? And so to have communal conversations, and the sorts of things that you'd be willing to submit yourself to something that you would maybe disagree with, but you submit to it. You know, I always give the example of when I was going to join the non-denominational reformed-ish, it was reformed-ish 2000s mega, they didn't believe in infant baptism. I was baptized in the Methodist Church. My baptism was correct. But I didn't argue with them. I mean, we're like, okay, this is this group, and this is what they believe. And in order for me to join their group, they said I had to be an adult who was fully immersed, right? And so what did I do? I did it. And my problem is like the creed. Here's the thing I struggle with. And when my wife and I joined the Orthodox Church, she's coming along, getting real close, which is awesome. Like, I'm just leaving that decision up to the bishop, right? Because I'm not going to make that. I'm saying, okay, I was baptized in the Methodist Church by an ordained Methodist pastor as an infant. Then I was immersed in the name of the Father and Son and the Holy Spirit by a non-denominationally ordained. It kind of wasn't like, there's a difference.
Yeah.
Right? And then I'll let them decide. And a lot of people go, oh, if you're not baptized in Orthodox Church, you're not baptized. I'm like, okay, if my bishop tells me that, I'm going to do that. But if he says, no, I want you to come in by chrismation. And then other people will sometimes, some of the hardcores will say, well, that's wrong. No, that's not I don't decide that. The bishop will decide that. And whatever the bishop says I need to do, I'll do because I want to join that thing. So even though I have ideas and about it or whatever, I'm very good about, once I realizing I'm going to join something, I'm going to submit myself into it, whether I agree with everything or not, if that or understand it fully or not, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think that's, and we have a temptation through the technology to be able to just, we want to decide, I will only submit to this unless I understand it fully. The problem is we can't understand everything fully only by the ideas. You just can't. That's not possible. It's, relationships between people and smell of a building. All these, there's so many, you can't even list all the other things of what it is, but I don't know, man. Well, I appreciate you coming on. I don't know if anyone else is, going to join in tonight, but I just thought, when I had some time tonight, I was like going out on a limb. I watched you the last 2 days, kind of put together these X reports. And if you're out there and you want to kind of fill along, I'm sure that Lance will keep live tweeting.
Well, so he asked one thing. I think Neil asked. So tomorrow, to be kind of early, the very last thing they're going to talk about tomorrow. They kind of pushed the controversial things toward the end, and they got a whole bunch of stuff done. So tomorrow, the PDK has chaired a committee, and they had some kind of financial things and some other things that were just like everyone unanimously pushed through. But one of the things they talked about was they're amending the mandate for the Banner, which is their flagship publication. And PDK chaired it, and it was only one report, so he was obviously on board with this, which is basically saying that they have to align themselves with the confessional stance, and because they're representing the CRC now. And right now, the more progressive elements, and so they love pushing, they push the progressive agenda in the Banner, right? And, if you're going to be, representing the CRC, it's a denominational publication. It has to come in line with it,
Yeah.
In some ways, the Banner's a relic. Like, people aren't getting their information from the Banner anymore, right? You know what I mean? Like, so to some extent,
it's kind of cute, isn't it? It's like a magazine that nobody reads. That we're gonna fight over, but it's an avenue. It is an avenue, and it does speak to the few people, the amount of people that do pay attention. The hardcore people.
So I could potentially see some people, I don't know, everything else is really kind of, I'm sure it'll pass, is that I'm sure some people will be offended that they're trying to dictate what the Banner can write about. And this, there's probably be some element, sure it'll pass, but as soon as I saw that, I realized, that could generate some interesting conversation. But
is the Banner did I see somebody say something like they wanted to just like report like news versus doing like op-eds? Was that part of that?
Well, it's really, I mean, for the longest time, and it was controlled, like he using Paul's words, like the Grand Rapids elite, the elite of the, and they would have all sorts of conversations. There were there would be, people would talk about theological conversation. I'm sure they would, talk about things of the day. Like one of the things they kind of have some strike throughs on the mandate was, and I think some of this stuff had gotten passed, and I should know this, but I think there was a move to basically say it was the banner's job to talk about dissenting views and stuff like that. I think they had that language in there so they could keep pumping out their propaganda on the left-wing propaganda. But, and then the Abide people formed because they didn't have a place where they could communicate their dissent with what was being, because there was all this heavy like struggle language and like all this stuff that was coming out of Grand Rapids, which we all lived through that crap, right? This is awful. And the banner was a part of that. So, so Paul's chaired that committee. They'll be up at 8:15 Eastern tomorrow. That was the only thing he had that might have some controversy. But the fact that they came out with one report, Paul's a part of it or whatever, I mean, it's going to pass. But I'll be curious to see if some people will have issues with like, why are we trying to dictate to the banner or what they can and can't say or whatever. But I think the people that are left, they understand what was happening with it.
Well, everybody in the corners rooting for Paul no matter what, I appreciate you coming on last minute. I mean, super last minute. It was like 8:30 and I was like, hey, you want to do a live stream? I don't know. I just liked your tweets and I was like, we could do this. And there's enough people I think that were interested, to make it a fun night.
And I think the thing that I like about the CRZ is you picked up on it. I mean, there are things that we're all dealing with, like, that the things that they're struggling with are things we're all going to have to struggle with. They're interesting things to deal with. And so for those of you, I've realized after this is that this will be the last Synod where I listen from start to finish. Unless fireworks start going off next year and I got to jump back in.
It's not spicy enough for Lance's attention for your Salience landscape anymore.
Well, because what happens is a lot of Synod stuff is like hours of sheer boredom and monotony of just, because you got to do the business of whatever.
The procedure.
Robert's you got to just do all this stuff. And it's like, oh, whatever. Yeah. But that, I think it's a good thing for the CRC. I think they've turned a corner and they can now move ahead in their new, in the new day that is the CRC.
Next year.
Lance, probably.
Just when I thought I was out, they pull me back in. All right, man. Well, I'm going to get us out of here. Thanks, Lance, for coming by tonight.
Take it easy. Thanks, Chris.
All right, you too. All right, everyone. Thanks for hanging out in the Hive Mind. We had a lively chat tonight. As these late nights normally go, a lot of people don't jump in because, like I said, they're usually like sitting in bed in their boxers. Their wife's watching some show on Netflix and they're like got one ear pod in listening to yours truly live at 10:30 at night, so Central Standard Time. Anyways, this was fun. God be with Paul as he presents his what are they called, the majority and the minority report, the combined for the banner. So it was making me think about being from the South, having family that used to work for Lifeway, and how Christianity Today and the Southern Baptist Convention is all was tied up downtown Nashville, but it was never actually a part of the Southern Baptist denomination or institution. It just existed as an evangelical publication, and it's just going to go where the wind blows. So it's interesting to see these things. Good night, everyone. Make sure you buy your ticket to the Midwest Estuary coming up, and I'm going to be there. Are you? It's going to be a good time.
Midwestuary 2025, August 22nd through the 24th in Elmhurst, Illinois. A weekend you won't want to miss, with special guests Cale Zeldin, Paul Vanderclay, Rod Dreher, Elizabeth Oldfield, John Vervaeke, and Jonathan Peugeot. Midwestuary 2025, the Fellowship of the Spirit. Stay tuned for more details. Visit us at midwestuary.com for ongoing updates.
Hi, this is Christian Baxter, and you're listening to Yours Truly, a place we go to think out loud.